My name is Chris Halfnight. I'm Senior Director of Research and Policy at Urban Green Council. Welcome to today's program on the Local Law 97 offsets and the Affordable Housing Reinvestment Fund. For those who don't know us, Urban Green Council is a New York City-based nonprofit. Our mission is to decarbonize buildings for healthy and resilient communities. And we advance that mission by convening experts and stakeholders to help us solve the hardest climate challenges facing buildings, and by conducting research, advocacy, and education. We've got a great webinar planned today with the city's experts to explain the nuts and bolts of the Local Law 97 offsets and the Affordable Housing Reinvestment Fund to get you everything you need to know about how the offsets will work, how you can buy them, and how the fund will work. This fund has been a longtime priority for Urban Green Council. We're thrilled to be hosting this webinar today. And Diva, if you could bring up the slides, and I'll ask our panelists to turn on their cameras so that I can introduce the crew today. Great. I'm not seeing the slides. Are they visible? There we go. Sorry, folks, a little technical difficulty, but all good. So today we have a great lineup for you from the city's experts on the Affordable Housing Fund and the Local Law 97 offsets. We're joined by Beth Golub, who is Director of Sustainability Policy and Legal Affairs at the New York City Department of Buildings. We have Jen Leone, who is Assistant Commissioner and Chief Sustainability Officer at the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, or HPD. And we have Megan Rosa, who is Senior Advisor at the New York City Energy Efficiency Corporation. This is the collection of agencies and entities that are responsible for the Local Law 97 offset pathway and the Affordable Housing Reinvestment Fund, and will be administering it. So they are the folks we want to hear from on this topic. I will remind everyone joining the webinar today that you can put your questions in the Q&A box. You can do that now, you can do that throughout the presentation, and you can also upvote questions that you want to see answered. I'll be coming back at the end of the presentation to moderate a short Q&A session, and we'll be looking to pose the questions that get the most upvotes. Our questions will start on today's topic, but we're also able to expand to any questions about Local Law 97 or this series of 10 webinars on compliance that the Department of Buildings has done. So feel free to put any questions in the box. And with that, I will pass it over to Beth to kick us off.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you, Urban Green, for hosting us this morning. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this last webinar in our series of compliance submission information as it relates to this first year of Local Law 97 submissions. So today's webinar, as has been described, will focus on purchasing offsets for Local Law 97 compliance. Okay, great. Next slide, please. So, as we've mentioned, we've been doing this series of webinars, and they describe the interaction between the sustainability laws and how these laws have correlating and also separate requirements. So we'll start with this timeline slide that we've used at the beginning of each of these webinars to set our foundation here. For Local Law 97, the deadline for a compliance submission is May 1st. We're very excited to be seeing the Local Law 97 compliance reports being submitted already. It's great in our new Local Law 97 portal. And that deadline of May 1st does have a 60-day grace period till June 30th. DOB also released a service notice last month, over a month ago now, that made clear that every building can apply for the extension to their compliance deadline to August 29th, with no prerequisites needed for that extension for the Local Law 97 compliance submission deadline being extended to August 29th. If a building is subject to both Local Law 97 and Local Law 88 this year, the 88 submission follows the 97 deadline. If a building is subject to 88 but not local law 97 this year, the deadline is May 1st with the 60-day grace period till June 30th. And the local law 84 deadline is May 1st. But today we're focusing on local law 97 and the offset purchase process. Local law 97 offsets must be purchased by the local law 97 compliance report deadline. And they can be purchased before or after the report itself is submitted, but they must be purchased by the deadline for that report submission. And we'll talk about that a bit more. Okay, next slide. So the concept of an affordable housing reinvestment fund was raised at the inception of the law of Local Law 97, but there were issues, and it again was mentioned as a priority in the Local Law 97 Advisory Board report to reduce emissions from buildings and to support affordable housing in doing so. At the same time, Local Law 97 authorizes a deduction for the purchase of offsets to be used as a compliance pathway with meeting a building's emissions limit. But the law does limit that deduction to up to 10% of a building's emissions limit. We'll talk about this a bit more. DOB, pursuant to the law, had to identify which offsets would be eligible for Local Law 97 compliance. And it's important to be selective about offset purchases because offsets can be criticized for a lack of integrity, which would mean that emissions reductions might not be permanent or might be overestimated. We'll talk a bit more about integrity principles of offsets as well. And so we've turned this priority of the law, this goal of the law, and this authorized deduction under the law into this exciting new program that generates high integrity offsets, the Affordable Housing Reinvestment Fund. So offsets purchased through the AHRF are the only offsets that are eligible for Local Law 97 compliance. Okay, next slide. So this is a visualization of how this program works, and I should highlight that this is a program that DOB has established with our partners at HPD, and the fund itself is administered by partners at NYCEEC. So Local Law 97 buildings can purchase offsets, the purchase price being $268 per offset, and the building would pay that price into the fund administered by NYCEEC. When that purchase clears, the purchaser gets a confirmation of their offset purchase, and the emissions deduction equal to that offset purchase amount will automatically be uploaded into the Local Law 97 reporting platform. So a building owner will see that deduction in their emissions on the inventory in that platform. Upon generation, the offset is retired, and then the offset is tracked in a registry that is maintained by our fund administrator, NYCEEC. When the eligible affordable housing building is engaged in a deep electrification project, the offset funds will be distributed to the project that's been identified by HPD to support that work. And that distribution and identification of projects and monitoring of those projects happens through HPD's REDi program framework, which we'll talk about again in a minute, a bit more. And then that offset registry will track the emissions reductions that are achieved by those projects over time. And part of the oversight of the projects includes that there is monitoring and verification by an independent third party, and that's done by our partners at NYCERDA. Okay, next slide. Okay, I'll pass it over to Megan to introduce NYCEEC.
Thanks, Beth. As Beth mentioned, NYCEEC is the fund administrator for this program. NYCEEC, or the New York City Energy Efficiency Corporation, is one of the first local green banks in the U.S. We were created by the New York City government in 2010, and in 2011, we spun out and became our own 501c3 mission-driven lender. We provide loans to support energy efficiency, renewable energy, battery storage, EV charging, and high performance building projects throughout New York City and New York State. We serve multiple real estate markets or sectors, and we work with the city on several programs such as this one, and we are also the New York City CPACE program administrator. Next slide.
Thank you for that, Megan. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the funding works through HPD's REDi program. REDi, which stands for the Resilient and Equitable Decarbonization Initiative, is a joint program between us and NYCERDA. And for those of you who are familiar with our retrofit electrification pilot, it's a successor to that program and a long-term goal of NYCERDA and HPD. So NYCERDA has provided funding to beneficially electrify already more than 1,300 households in HPD's preservation pipeline. And that means projects coming to HPD for financing for building retrofits. And REDi is a voluntary program that supports specifically electrification work. The REDi program itself, as a successor to the pilot, will continue to fund projects that are doing this work. What's really critical for the purposes of the offset program which flows through REDi are a couple things that I'm going to talk about. First of all, as Beth noted, all REDi projects have significant oversight by both us and a NYCERDA funded technical assistance provider, right? So we're really carefully looking at the scopes of our electrification projects, the design and the outcome. Also, as noted, REDi funds supplement city dollars to meet the city's climate goals. And that's really important because HPD focuses on building health, and REDi is supplemental for the electrification piece. And also what's critical is HPD and REDi has a large pipeline of projects that are really good candidates for building electrification, for clean cooling, clean heating, and so on. And adding the AHRF dollars ensures that we don't have to turn away really good candidates in the low-income building sector where electrification is really critical and provides many benefits. Next slide. So the methodology, it took us some time to figure out how to stand up an offset program. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we did that. First of all, every offset purchase funds 1 ton of carbon emissions reduced by one of these eligible retrofit projects that's coming through our REDi program, right? And that's specifically for electrification of heating and hot water. And when we say eligible, these projects are not allowed to be subject to emissions limits under local law 97. That's really important.
Hi, it seems Jen is frozen. Am I the only one who that is happening for?
No, that's also happening for me, so I assume that's happening for everybody. Beth or Megan, are you able to jump in here, or should we move to another slide and then while Jen gets in via telephone?
Yeah, I think Jen, are you there? Are you able to pick up where you just left off, or should we come back? All right, let's move on, and if we should have time later to discuss the methodology, and if there are any questions about the methodology, certainly put them in the chat and we can address them.
Well,
Sorry
I think
about
Jen
that.
might
I
have
am
just come
back.
back on.
Oh, great.
I'm back. I'm going to stay off video to avoid that happening again.
Perfect.
So we designed our program so that funding is sized appropriately for the emissions reductions that we are calculating for our projects. We vetted our methodology with NYCERDA, and we compared it against other legitimate emissions reductions methodologies. The calculations are based on incremental savings compared to a business as usual HPD scope. We only want to count emissions that wouldn't have happened otherwise. The funding varies because the emissions vary based on a building's base fuel type, right? If it's an oil building, the savings are more significant than a gas building. And of course, it's scaled to the building size and unit count. Again, more work, more emissions reductions. And what's also really critical is along the way, our technical assistance provider vet the project's baseline fuel type, fuel use, building type, and so on, and the project scope, all along from initial conception and application through REDi to the point at which the project scope is finalized. And that is really to make sure that the deemed savings are achieved. Next slide. It's really important that the offsets exhibit the core environmental integrity principles as outlined in Local Law 97. So this includes the following. First of all, the offsets need to be real and quantifiable. I think it's clear that offsetting fossil fuel use in New York City is real, and the methodology is transparent. We've talked about it publicly, and it's vetted. Secondly, the offsets have to be permanent. We only are funding projects that are permanently electrifying buildings. That is, the emissions can't be released back into the atmosphere. And these are permanent electrification projects. Additionality is a concept specifically in this program. Offsets cannot be used, as I mentioned before, to offset emissions that are required by law or regulation. So these are specifically projects not subject to Local Law 97 emissions. Verifiable, we are validating the design of our scopes, and the results are verified by a third party, and that's the technical assistance provider funded through NYCERDA and the REDi program. They are unique. Each credit corresponds to 1 ton of emissions, and our offsets are tracked, right? We are watching, keeping our eyes on the scope, and ultimately all of our projects are benchmarked, not just through Local Law 84, but through HPD's benchmarking protocol. And finally, the baselines. We are certainly aware of the projects coming in and what their base fuel type and base emissions and energy use are. And all of our emissions reductions are predicated on that. Next slide. And just, a little bit more about how this plays out in real life to help visualize the program better. If you can imagine, on the left side of the screen, we have an offset purchaser. So assuming a building subject to Article 320, attempting or purchasing 10% of their emissions limits. In this case, 1,740 megatons of emissions at a purchase price of $468,000. All of those funds will be transferred through NYCEEC and allocated to a specific HPD project. In this case, these are theoretical, of course, because we haven't received any funding, but these are 2 projects that would be typical in our REDi program. So an 8-unit oil-heated building, electrifying heating and hot water, and a similar 10-unit building doing the same. This one is actually subject to Article 321, so is allowed to be utilized. And you can see our deemed savings between the 2 buildings equate to the same offsets that are being purchased by the program. So $468,000 moves from the purchaser into these HPD projects. 20 households are beneficially electrified, and the total savings, 1,740 tons over the 20-year life cycle we're calculating for the purpose of this program. Next slide.
Okay, thank you, Jen. So now we will talk about the steps for an actual offset purchase process. So the AHRF offsets are now available for purchase. In the chat, you'll see both DOB's Article 320 guide that is available on DOB's Local Law 97 website. And that guide now has provisions that describe the offsets for Local Law 97 compliance and describe how to purchase the offsets. And those provisions begin in the guide at page 112. And also in the chat is the website, the link for NYCEEC's AHRF offset page. And you'll hear more about when to visit that page. So to purchase offsets, the first thing to do is to calculate the purchase amount. So to be clear, the maximum allowable offset purchase is 10% of a building's emissions limit. So, of course, emissions limits are calculated using property types and emissions factors. For the purpose of offsets, this is a building's emissions limit before any adjustment is applied as it relates to 320.7, 320.8, 320.9. Those adjusted emissions limits are not the emissions limit at issue. It is the building's unadjusted emissions limit. If you've been following this webinar series, we did a webinar on combined reports. There are two opportunities for buildings to submit combined reports, which means that multiple buildings would be included in a report. If buildings follow the same compliance pathway, share an owner, and are also on the same tax lot, they can be submitted in a combined report, meaning there would be only one filing fee and one RDP attesting to the contents of the report. But the buildings in that report would be reported separately with separate calculations and emissions limits. In that context, in that combined report, those buildings would be submitted individually on the application, and it's each building's emissions limit that the 10% would be applied to. However, if buildings are submitting a combined report with aggregated emissions, which is allowed in this first compliance period, where the buildings are owned by the same owner, they're on the same tax lot, they follow the same Local Law 97 compliance pathway, and they share energy, in an aggregated emissions report, the 10% applies to the group's aggregated emissions limit. So again, multiple buildings in a combined report without aggregated emissions that's each building's offset purchase is separate, and that 10% applies to each building's emissions limit, and each building is entered separately on the application. Additionally, if a building is complying with Article 321 through the performance pathway demonstrating compliance with the 2030 emissions limit, the 10% applies to that building's 2030 emissions limit. And once the emissions limit is identified, then the owner can identify 10% of the emissions limit, which is the maximum allowable offset purchase. And then using energy use data, the owner can identify the amount that the building is in excess of their emissions limit. And if that amount is less than 10% of the emissions limit, then the building only needs to purchase enough offsets to achieve compliance, which might be less than 10% of the emissions limit. If a building is more than 10% over the emissions limit, the building can only purchase up to 10% of the emissions limit. And yeah, we'll continue to talk about these concepts in this purchase process. But one last thing to note is that the minimum purchase would be one offset. And then after that initial first offset is purchased, offsets can be purchased in tenths. Okay, next slide. So the Local Law 97 reporting portal, BEAM, does have a ticket, which is a calculator that can be used to assess potential offset purchases. And if a building has connected its ESPM data to BEAM, then the calculator will use the building's gross floor area to establish and property use types to establish its emissions limit and its energy use data to estimate its emissions overage and then show the building its maximum purchase amount and allow the building owner to adjust that purchase amount to assess different purchases. And while this is an available tool on BEAM on the Local Law 97 reporting portal, it wouldn't be submitted. It wouldn't be, DOB won't be seeing the information that's input and assessed in here. This is just to assist buildings in making their offset purchases. And then just again, offsets have to be purchased pursuant to the law within the reporting calendar year. So offsets to be reduced from on a building's 2024 annual emissions have to be purchased in 2025. And that purchase has to happen in time for the building's deadline for their submission. However, the purchase can happen before or after the 97 compliance report is submitted. Okay, next slide. So this is a sample of a calculation for a building that was over its emissions limit and purchased offsets to achieve compliance with the emissions limit. So this is a multi-family building. At the top, you'll see the fuel types and their amounts. 2024 annual fuel use shows the amount of fuel that was used for each fuel type and the coefficients for those fuels which together are used to calculate the emissions resulting from the fuel use in 2024. So when added, the annual emissions are 225.6 for this building. Then in the middle row, you see the property use types and the square footage are used to calculate the emissions limit for this building, which all together would be 207. So the emissions limit being 207, in the bottom row, you'll see that the maximum allowable offset purchase for this building would be 10% of 207. That's 20.7. The amount that the building's annual emissions are over the emissions limit is actually 18.6, slightly less than the maximum allowable purchase. And so by purchasing 18.6 offsets, this building achieves compliance with the emissions limit of 207. Okay, great. I'll pass it off to Megan.
Thanks, Beth. So once a building owner or building owner's rep has determined that they would like to purchase offsets, they will visit NYCEEC's AHRF offset website, and they'll be able to download, complete, and sign the offset purchase application. Once the application has been completed, they must email it to nycoffsets@nyceec.com. Next slide. For the application, part one will just ask for some contact information of the person filling out the offset purchase application. This is just needed in case we have any questions. Part two will ask for some additional information about the purchaser, such as the legal full name, contact information, just some basic information if the purchaser is not the building owner. Next slide, please. Part 3 will ask for information about the buildings that the purchaser is requesting to purchase offsets for. It will ask for the BBL and the bin, as well as the quantity of offsets and the number of offsets in dollar amounts. Part 4 will ask for aggregate information. This is applicable if there are multiple buildings that the purchaser is requesting to purchase offsets for. And again, the purchaser will send the completed purchase application to nycoffsets@nyceec.com. Next slide, please. Once the purchaser has submitted the application to NYCEEC, NYCEEC will confirm that we have received the application. We will respond via email. After we have done a basic check of the information in the application, just making sure everything has been filled out and is accurate, we will send a confirmation email back to the purchaser, as well as wire instructions on where to send payment for the offset purchases. Once the building owner wires payment to the AHRF bank account, they must email NYCEEC to notify that payment has been sent. Once we have confirmed that we have received the funds, we will finalize the offset purchase in the offset public registry and issue a certificate to the building owner that lists the amount of offsets purchased associated with the local law 97 covered buildings, including the bin, BBL, and address, and the date that the offsets were generated and retired. Please note that the offset purchases are non-refundable and non-transferable. Thank you, and next.
Great, thank you, Megan. Just a couple notes. Thank you so much, Megan, for walking us through that. On the application itself, there's the did I just lose the slides, or the slides no longer? Oh, here we go. Sorry. So on the application, the first contact information is for whoever's completing that application. That might be an owner's rep, it might be a service provider. But the second part, the purchaser, that's the local law 97 building owner. And so that is where the building owner's information will be completed. And in the section about each building, the BBL and bin for the building and the address have to match that BBL and bin as it appears in Beam. So if those identifiers match, if the BBL and bin matched on the application, as I described, the purchase will be automatically uploaded into Beam and will appear in the building's emissions in Beam. And that would happen within a week of a purchase clearing. So if for any reason that automatic deduction in Beam doesn't appear in a week, there could be an issue with the BBLs and bins matching up. And so you can email DOB at beam_LL97 at buildings.nyc.gov, and we'll help troubleshoot any purchases that aren't appearing in the reporting portal. One more thing to note, which is in the case of a combined report with aggregated emissions, where it's 10% of the group's aggregated emissions limit, that application needs to include the BBLs that represent that report as they appear on Beam. And that application doesn't need to include bins and address, but it does need to include the BBLs exactly as they appear on Beam. If there are multiple BBLs in that submission, there may be a pipe between the BBLs, and it would need to be entered exactly again as it appears on Beam. So any issues relating to having a purchase appear in Beam, please do reach out to the beam_L97 at buildings email address. Okay, next slide. So this is just a rundown of the webinar series that we are wrapping up here today. We did the first 9 or so not with Urban Green, but with AHRF. Those webinars are available online, and they covered all of the topics that you see here. And this offset webinar today is our final in this series. So thank you so much, and we hope these have been helpful resources for everyone.
Fantastic. Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Megan. That was a super informative and helpful overview. We're going to turn to some moderator and audience questions now. And as I mentioned off the top, we're going to focus first on the Local Law 97 offsets and Affordable Housing Fund topic, but then we will expand to really anything under Local Law 97 or these 10 webinars that DOB has done. So please do put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A. There are many in there already. I will flag for you all that the webinar and slides will be available after the program. And I'll also note that the Department of Buildings team is answering questions in the Q&A box in real time, and you may need to click over to the answered column on your Q&A box to see those. We're also going to try and hit a number of them in the Q&A function right now. So let's start with a bit of a bigger picture question. There were a couple notes in the Q&A on this. Just pulling back sort of out of the details, when Local Law 97 was passed, the law included a fairly generic definition of offsets. The Department of Buildings rules and now this fund fill out that different definition with a new, innovative, and frankly, uniquely beneficial kind of offset. Beth, can you walk us through how these AHRF offsets are different from typical offsets and why the city opted for this approach? What are its benefits?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. We're really excited about these offsets. We think they're a great addition to, achieving emissions reductions in buildings in New York City. Um, we needed to, DOB was required to identify offsets to be used for local law 97 compliance. And the beauty of these offsets is that not only can we track them and verify them with our partners at HPD and at NYCEEC, but all of the emissions reductions and economic benefits are hyper local within New York City. And on top of that, we get to advance the city's interests in sustainable, affordable housing. So it's a win all around, and it is especially uniquely related to the goals of Local Law 97, emissions reductions in New York City, decarbonizing buildings in New York City.
Fantastic. Thank you. Let's turn to the question of verification. This came up in Jen, in your portion of the presentation, and there are a couple notes on it in the chat. You mentioned that NYSERDA will verify the emission savings from projects funded by the offsets. What does that actually look like in practice? And then we did have a couple questions in the Q&A on what happens if there is a shortfall because the project doesn't work out as planned, or in the other direction, actually it ends up saving more carbon than originally anticipated.
So yeah, let me try and answer that. First of all, we are trying to make sure that this works programmatically and is also meeting these same goals that everyone's asking about. So in terms of vetting the projects, we have a very complicated application process and tool for any project going through our REDi program. So when a project applies, there's a huge amount of information produced and given to us about the existing building type, fuel use, and so on. And then the applicant enters their proposed electrification scope along with, related efficiency measures pertinent to that scope. The tool then, and as part of the application process, will calculate the emissions based on the baseline conditions and the proposed scope. The amount of offsets is based initially on that application and the sort of early decision on the scoping for the project, scoping and size, number of units. The NYCERDA supported technical assistance team will watch that scope as it evolves on our way to a financial closing for the project, and making sure that that scope and those selections are maintained throughout the design of the process. If the scope changes for any reason and the corresponding emissions savings estimate, then prior to the project closing on financing, we would recalculate the incentive. That takes care of the design phase. So what we're projecting matches up really closely with the scope that gets built. This is an HPD project. If anyone's worked on our projects, you can't just change your mind after the fact, right? You are really held to that project scope along the course of the design. Things do happen, of course, but that would actually follow the REDi protocol, which would mean, if a project doesn't happen, the funding doesn't happen for that thing. That is extremely rare for HPD. The technical assistance provider also oversees the construction of our projects, primarily for quality control, not for the purpose of the offset program, but again, ensuring that the scope is achieved throughout the construction. Finally, you never really know the emissions that will happen in real life. That's what benchmarking is for. And that process over time is going to ensure, or at least monitor, whether those savings are achieved. We think our calculations are pretty airtight. If over time they don't meet up exactly to our projections, not that much you can do about that. Because, as you know, you can't run an incentive program based on a 20-year emissions reduction in the future. However, this program, typically, because we have caps on our funding, we're typically doing a lot more emissions reductions on any project than the funding covers, which means on the balance, we're always veering toward more emissions reductions on any funded project rather than less. I think I hit all the points of your questions, but if I didn't, let me know. Oh, there was another. If we overachieve, like I said, great. It's great for the city. It's great for projects. We wouldn't plan to reconcile funding and come back and ask for more offsets. That would just be a benefit to, all of our communities, buildings, and New York City at large.
The icing on the cake. That's great. Thanks, Jen. Let's turn to the price of offsets. So as mentioned, they're priced at $268 per deemed ton. There are a number of questions in the Q&A on sort of why. How was this price determined? Beth, maybe you're best positioned to answer this, but open to all panelists. How was the offset purchase price determined? Why not just pay the fine? What's the difference there?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Thanks everybody for asking. The offset purchase price was determined using that methodology that Jen described, and also mirroring the approach that was used to determine the cost of Local Law 97 penalties, which was calculated to mirror the cost of doing the work of actually reducing 1 ton of emissions. So that applies here as well. This is the price of reducing 1 ton of emissions. And we're balancing the goals of owners doing the work at their buildings, and if for any reason, for whatever the reason is, that the building is not within the emissions limit in this first compliance year, that fund, the amount to reduce the emissions will still go towards reducing emissions in buildings. So, this isn't meant to be a free pass. This is meant to achieve the goals of Local Law 97. And, we'll be working with our partners at HPD and NYCEEC to watch the program and ensure that the metrics are set to achieve success.
Great. Thanks, Beth. Turning to NYCEEC and Megan, you mentioned that NYCEEC will do diligence when a building owner submits an application for a Local Law 97 offset. Can you expand on that? What does that mean? What does that look like in practice?
Yeah, the diligence is just a basic check on the purchaser, just, checking the full legal name, the entity address, the federal EIN. It's all listed in the application, but it is relatively simple.
Got it. Thank you. I'm going to turn to the questions in the Q&A because we do have quite a few. Maybe first, there were several questions looking for the link for the offsets program and where to purchase. That should be in the chat. There's two links, and one of them is to NYCEEC's page where the offsets can be purchased. So please take a look at that. We have a couple questions around on the REDi program, and one in particular is REDi applicable for NYCHA projects. Jen, could you just tell us a little bit more about which buildings are eligible under the REDi program? Where would these projects be happening?
Sure. Great question. So the REDi program is specifically for projects that are doing a retrofit through one of HPD's preservation programs. So if anybody's done an HPD project before, programs like our green housing preservation program or year 15. So a project would apply, or a building owner would apply to HPD first to participate in one of these preservation programs. If you've not done that before, we are creating regulated affordable housing. This is not simply an incentive program. Any project that is coming through one of the HPD preservation programs at the time that they're going through that process, once they're in HPD's pipeline, that's the point at which a project would apply to REDi. So it's very specific. It's very specific because there's a lot of need and a lot of regulation over the program at large. So it's a good fit for a program like offsets that has to be so, critically verifiable. There's no anticipation that a NYCHA project would come through that program. NYCHA projects do go through a packed program in some cases where there's some coordination with HPD, but the REDi program is not generally applicable to those. That's not to say it couldn't happen, but I don't imagine it would.
Not anticipated. Great. Thank you, Jen. There are several questions around the timeline for purchase of offsets. Can offsets be purchased after the Local Law 97 report is filed? If so, what's the deadline for that? And in particular, how will a building be considered compliant if the offset is purchased after the report is filed? You touched on this a bit, Beth, but could you walk us through that again and maybe clarify that point?
Sure. Thanks, Chris. So, if you've been attending our webinars and you've been following the Local Law 97 compliance submission process, there are various steps that have to happen in that process to get a building's Local Law 97 compliance report submitted. This includes first paying the filing fee in DOB Now, then the building has to connect the building's energy use data from ESPM to Beam. So that's required both for Local Law 84 and for Local Law 97. In the context of Local Law 97, once the ESPM data is connected to Beam, to the Local Law 97 reporting portal, at that point, a registered design professional or a service provider that has that design professional's attestation for those materials has to go into the reporting portal and confirm the building's data, confirm the building's emissions limit, confirm the building's energy usage, property use types. And in some cases, that might mean that the professional is confirming what was ported over from ESPM. In some cases, it might actually be updating or changing, tweaking what was ported over from ESPM. In either case, a professional has to engage with the data when it's in the reporting portal, when it's in Beam, and confirm it. So that includes submitting a ticket. That part of the process where a professional actually submits the Local Law 97 compliance report by providing their attestation and saying the data is here and it's accurate in my professional discretion. That can happen before or after the offset purchase happens. So when the offset purchase happens, a deduction will be applied in the reporting portal, and it could be applied to the submitted report, or it could be applied to the data before the report has been submitted. And DOB will audit those purchases and ensure that they were in the appropriate amounts. And that purchase just has to happen by the building's reporting deadline. So DOB will wait for the deadline to ensure that the report is complete.
Got it. One quick follow-up question. Do you have a sense of timeline for that process, for the amount of time from application to transferring to Beam?
So I believe the purchases will be uploaded weekly. However, there could be a couple days that it would take for the purchase to actually clear and be confirmed. So, it's best to give a little bit of a buffer, maybe 1 to 5 business days, to make sure
Got it.
your purchase clears in time.
Perfect, but relatively quickly. Let's do a couple quick questions on the offsets in the fund, and then turn to some broader questions on local law 97. First, can an owner rep be the offset purchaser, or does that need to be the owner, him or herself?
Yep, an owner rep can be, oh, sorry, the owner rep can be the purchaser's agent.
Purchaser's
So
agent.
that's the top of the application. This is the contact person who can communicate about the purchase itself. The purchaser is the building owner. This is the person or the entity that the offsets will be retired on behalf of.
Great. And then last question, and then we'll move on to broader questions. Can an Article 321 building purchase AHRF offsets to meet the 2030 threshold? You touched on that briefly, but also, will the 321 performance pathway, if they go that route, will those buildings only need to purchase offsets one time?
Yep, that's correct. So buildings that are achieving compliance under Article 321 through the emissions performance can purchase offsets to meet their emissions limit, and that is just a one-time requirement. But again, we'll note that the 10%, the maximum allowable purchase, would be that building's 2030 emissions limit.
Great. So turning to broader questions on local law 97, there are a lot of them in the Q&A. First, on extensions, are the grace and extension periods penalty free for everyone, regardless of whether or not the building meets its emissions limits?
Yep, that's correct. So the grace period relates to the penalty for failing to file the report. So that grace period is a period of time where a building can get their materials in. The emissions limit penalty is a separate determination. And as I said, emissions limits won't be reviewed until the deadline, so that buildings have time to purchase offsets and apply that deduction to the emissions.
Great. I'm gonna keep rapid fire sending them your way, Beth.
Great.
There are several questions on RECs. I'll bundle two of them together. Is there a cap as to what percentage of one's electricity consumption can be offset through RECs or renewable energy credits? And also, how can one determine if RECs produced by solar that feeds into Zone J is Local Law 97 eligible?
So currently, RECs are allowable to cover electricity consumption. There is no additional restriction beyond only being applied to electricity consumption at this point in time. And also at this point in time, the only RECs that would be eligible for Local Law 97 compliance would be Tier 4 RECs.
Great, thank you. Let's see. Maybe just going back to a question on the offsets. I think this was touched on, but it's worth underscoring. Can offsets be carried over from one year to the next if a building buys a certain number and doesn't ultimately need them all for compliance?
So the law does require that offsets are purchased within the reporting calendar year. And that's why it's important for a building to calculate their purchase amount because AHRF offsets are non-refundable. Um, that said, DOB is going to be watching this program and supporting building owners as they work to engage with this program and its, initial um, pilot moment here. And so we'll be watching to adjust for any issues that are encountered that are unexpected. But generally speaking, offsets are required to be purchased in the calendar year of the report.
Great. A quick question on fees, and then I think we may need to wrap up. But if you have two buildings under the same BBL, but with different building identification numbers, BINs, both owned by the same entity, should filing fees be paid separately for each building, or is a single payment sufficient for both BINs? I suspect many are in that case.
Yeah, so this goes back to that concept of combined reports that I referenced a few times. A filing fee is due for every report. So if buildings are submitting separate reports, they would have separate filing fees. And if they're being submitted in a combined report, it would be just the one filing fee.
Fantastic. There are many, many questions in the Q&A. Unfortunately, that's all we have time to hit today, but I know the DOB team did answer a lot of questions in real time in writing in the Q&A box. So please take a look at the answered questions there. I want to thank all of our panelists for a very thoughtful and informative presentation today. I also want to thank all of you for your tireless work on Local Law 97 implementation. I do also want to thank our audience. We really do appreciate you coming to this program. We couldn't bring you great programs like this without your support, and we appreciate that support for all the work we do. A reminder that the webinar is recorded, will be available on Urban Green and the Department of Buildings websites after the webinar is done. You can find more information about everything covered today in the updated Article 320 guidance that was referenced, and also on NYCEEC's website, in particular for the Local Law 97 offsets and how to go about purchasing those offsets. And then, of course, everything about Local Law 97 is accessible on the Department of Buildings website as well. So thank you all again for joining, and we hope to see you at a future Urban Green program.